The blue light from 3 monitors carved deep lines into her face. Chloe Martinez watched the viewer counter. It sat at 5. She kept talking, kept demonstrating, kept her hands moving across the keys with precise, rhythmic clicks, but the silence of the chat room was heavier than the noise. She clicked end stream. The screen flickered, then died, leaving the room in a thick, stagnant darkness. She reached for her phone to check her balance. 0. The numbers mocked her. A sharp headache pulsed behind her temples, the kind that came from 10 hours of staring at pixels while the rent deadline loomed. She pulled up her work schedule for the customer service shift starting in 6 hours. Another night of listening to complaints for minimum wage. She stood up, her joints stiff, and walked to the kitchen for water. The tap sputtered, a dry metallic rattle that echoed her own state of depletion. She stared at the wall, the weight of the endless cycle pressing into her shoulders. She had been grinding for months, yet the finish line only seemed to move further away. She returned to her desk, the empty room waiting, and sat back down, the cold air of the apartment settling around her. Sleep was a luxury she could not afford. Chloe pulled a spiral notebook from beneath a stack of cables and pressed a pen to the paper. She didn't open a game. She opened a browser. She searched for the top 10 creators in her niche, but she ignored their playstyles and their catchphrases. She tracked their brands. She listed their private labels. She noted the price points of their merchandise lines. Her pen scratched against the page, faster and faster, as the patterns emerged. Every top earner was using the stream merely as a megaphone to shout about something else. A product, a service, a brand. The streaming room wasn't a bank, it was just a storefront, and she was currently working for free. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She looked at the monitors, now silent and dark, and saw them not as her life, but as a trap. The cycle of endless content creation was a treadmill designed to keep her running in place. She turned the page, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote a single word at the top. Platform. She wasn't going to play the game anymore. She was going to build the infrastructure that others played on. The exhaustion didn't vanish, but it shifted into a sharp, cold focus. She had a plan, and for the first time in months, the numbers in her head finally added up. The next month, the ad revenue arrived a small, pathetic sum. It was enough for a new headset, the kind that would stop the feedback loop, the kind that would make her voice sound crisp and professional. Chloe stared at the checkout page for the equipment, her finger hovering over the mouse. She looked at her headset, taped together at the bridge, then closed the window. She opened a different tab, a freelancer portal. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she drafted the project brief for a landing page. It was a gaming tutorial course, a structure for her knowledge. The developer sent an invoice for the initial deposit. It was every cent she had earned that month. She stared at the bank portal, the cursor blinking like a countdown. If this failed, she would be unable to pay her next utility bill. If this failed, she was back to square one with nothing. She typed her password, her hand steady despite the internal panic, and clicked authorize. The screen refreshed. Her balance plummeted to near 0. A confirmation email pinged on her phone, a small, cold sound in the quiet room. She had just traded her immediate comfort for a digital ghost. She leaned back, the chair groaning under her weight, and watched the status bar of the project file begin to load. The interface arrived on her laptop, clean and functional. Chloe sat before the camera, her routine unchanged, yet the air in the room felt different. She started the stream as usual, but instead of loading a game, she pulled the landing page onto her main display. The chat moved fast, then slowed. Questions crawled up the side of the screen. Why is there a payment link? Are you selling out? Just play the game, Chloe. The skepticism hit her like a physical weight, pinning her to the chair. She read a comment asking if she had lost her edge. Her pulse quickened. The temptation to close the tab, to revert to the familiar, to just play and satisfy the crowd was immense. She looked at the camera, then down at the screen where her months of research and sacrifice were distilled into a single button. She felt the silence of the room press in. She didn't explain. She didn't apologize. She moved the cursor over the command. Her finger tightened on the mouse. She looked at the blinking cursor, took a breath that felt like a sharp intake of cold air, and clicked publish. The page went live, broadcasting to the internet, and the room went quiet. The stream was still running, but Chloe had muted her microphone. She watched the chat scroll by. a mix of confusion and indifference. Minutes stretched into an hour. The site was live, yet the dashboard remained empty. Zero sales, zero interest. The silence in the room began to feel heavy, suffocating. She reached for her water, her fingers trembling slightly. She had emptied her accounts for this. If the market ignored her, there was no backup plan. She stared at the phone resting on her desk, its screen dark. She considered ending the stream, ending the experiment, and going back to the safety of the game. Then, the phone lit up. A sharp, digital chirp sliced through the quiet. She snatched the device, her thumb swiping across the glass. A notification hung there, bright and clear. $20. Someone, somewhere, had clicked buy. She looked back at the monitor, at the empty stream, and then down at the phone again. The money had arrived while she was doing nothing. She hadn't played around, hadn't cracked a joke for the chat, and hadn't begged for donations. The system had worked on its own. She set the phone down, her pulse slowing, and watched the cursor blink on the dashboard. The game was no longer the only thing that mattered. The first sale was a leak in a dam that quickly became a flood. Chloe stopped checking her phone for notifications. She started checking the server load. She spent her mornings analyzing which modules sold fastest and her afternoons hiring developers to refine the user interface. She pushed updates to the site while her viewers waited for a stream that never started. The cursor on her monitor no longer hovered over game controls, but over profit margin spreadsheets and traffic analytics. She replaced her gaming headset with a dual monitor setup dedicated to logistics. When the platform hit 1,000 users, she didn't celebrate with a broadcast. She sat in the dark, scrolling through back-end logs, watching the automation handle the traffic. She saw the patterns, where users clicked, where they dropped off, and where the revenue spiked. She adjusted the pricing models and watched the ripple effect in real time. The thrill was no longer in the performance, but in the efficiency of the machine she had built. She logged out of her streaming account, left the software idle, and opened the architectural schematics of her next course. The screen was no longer a stage. It was a workspace. Chloe walked into the boardroom, the air conditioning humming against the glass walls. She placed a single, thick folder on the mahogany table. 3 men sat opposite her, their eyes flicking to her profile, clearly expecting a summary of her subscriber base or a breakdown of her reach on social platforms. She didn't open with her follower count. She didn't mention the number of hours she had spent live. Instead, she opened the folder to the final page of her fiscal report. She pointed to the profit margin line, then to the asset diversification map. The silence in the room deepened as she detailed the revenue streams flowing from her education platform. She spoke of user retention rates, overhead reduction, and the scalability of her proprietary software. The men leaned in, their pens hovering over notepads, their focus shifting from her personality to the viability of her venture. She watched them scan the columns of data, observing their shift from casual interest to professional calculation. She held her ground, hands folded on the table, waiting for the first question. She was no longer a creator selling attention. She was an architect presenting a structural asset. She watched the lead investor tap the table and nod. The power of ownership was clear in the figures on the page. The notification pinged at 3 a.m. Chloe tapped the screen, watching the bank balance update. 7 figures. The $1 million milestone. She didn't shout or pace. She simply refreshed the page to confirm the digit had held. She opened the quarterly report for her merchandise brand, cross-referencing the inventory turnover with the incoming wire transfers. The numbers aligned perfectly. She scrolled through the startup portfolio, clicking into the profit and loss statements for each of the 5 companies under her control. There were no more viewers to appease, no more chats to moderate. She pulled up the tax documents and verified the quarterly tax liability against her projected growth. She spent the next 30 minutes adjusting the capital allocation for her next round of asset expansion. Every entry was a record of independence. She closed the browser tabs one by one, watching the dashboard fade to black. The room was silent, save for the hum of the cooling fan on the server rack. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out over the city. The work was done. The machine was running on its own, and for the first time in years, the clock on her monitor didn't dictate her next move. She turned away from the desk, leaving the screen dark. A message blinked on the corner of her monitor. It was a fellow streamer, someone she had known since her early days. How do you keep the audience hooked every single day without burning out? Chloe didn't type a reply. Instead, she toggled her screen share. She opened a directory containing 5 distinct business portals. She clicked through the analytics for each: the merchandise brand, the education platform, the software startup. The other streamer went silent in the chat. Chloe leaned into her microphone, her voice steady and devoid of the usual performance cadence. I stopped playing to win the game and started building the platform others play on. She didn't wait for a rebuttal or a question. She reached for the mouse, moved the cursor to the streaming software, and clicked the stop button. The broadcast ended instantly. She clicked the secondary button to close the application entirely. The streaming interface vanished. The camera light flickered and died. She watched the black space on her screen for a beat, disconnected the headset, and set it down on the desk. The monitors remained dark. She had finished her last broadcast. Chloe pushed her chair back. The wheels scraped against the hardwood, a sharp sound in the empty room. She reached out and flipped the power switch on the main tower. The soft glow from the keyboard faded, leaving the desk in shadow. She walked to the door, paused, and looked back at the rows of equipment that had once defined her existence. Now, they were just hardware. She reached for the light switch and clicked it down. The office plunged into darkness. She stepped into the hallway, the cool air from the ventilation system hitting her face as she moved toward the exit. She pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The evening city lights stretched out before her, unfiltered and vast. She didn't look back at the building. She walked toward the street, her pace steady, her hands empty of controllers or cables. The rhythm of the city moved around her, a chaotic, shifting tide, but she remained anchored. She turned the corner, the streetlights catching her movement, and disappeared into the flow of the evening. The monitors in the office remained cold and dark, the software permanently silenced, and the game she had once played was left far behind.